Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for October 20th, 2022. There's a lot to cover today because we're seeing a crash going on with European governments, chaos in the markets, and a new push for war, an accelerated push for war, highlighted by the emergency trip by British Defense Minister Wallace to Washington, D.C. yesterday, where he had meetings with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The cover story to this trip is that they're discussing the alleged use by Russia of Iranian drones in Ukraine against the Ukrainian infrastructure. The British Armed Forces Minister Heapy said it is, quote, particularly grave, unquote, that such, quote, conversations are necessary, unquote. And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, described the situation as urgent, and he said that high-level conversations could not be conducted by phone. So we don't have a full picture yet of what was discussed, but we can assure you that it was probably not the use of drones that caused this meeting. Now, the Russian view is that an escalation is coming because the Kiev government has publicly asked for nuclear weapons. And Zelensky last week called for a preemptive or a preventive nuclear strike. Now, this is quite dramatic language coming from Kiev. We don't know exactly what the response is from the West. They keep saying no, no, no. But they're continuing to pour weapons into Ukraine. Meanwhile, NATO and Russia are both conducting nuclear exercises today as we are doing this update. Now, it's important to recognize, as much as people want to blame the United States for everything, and as bad as the US is, the driver behind this is the British establishment. In particular, the City of London, which is trying to impose a regime on the world, a great reset, to defend their collapsing financial system. And as they have so often in the last 50 years, using the US military as the giant, the dumb giant, to enable them to carry this out. Let's just take a look at how they've shaped this crisis. Beyond the whole buildup going back to the 2014 coup, where the British played a leading role through US networks, including Joe Biden with the coup in Ukraine, in the most recent period, we had the Boris Johnson visit to Kiev to meet with Zelensky to give the word from NATO and the British, no negotiations with Russia, when it appeared as though a negotiated settlement was possible. He also went the next month to Sweden and Finland to sign bilateral military agreements, which were the prelude to bring Sweden and Finland into NATO by putting them under NATO's Article 5 umbrella. Then you have the British think tanks, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, issuing a call for a Crimea missile crisis as a way of driving the Russians out. You have the Atlantic Council engaging in open discussions of whether or not nuclear war is likely and what the West must do, including using preemptive nuclear strikes as a way of stopping nuclear war. You have the Economist, the City of London mouthpiece, saying that Putin has to be finished off quickly so you can deal with the threat from China. You have King Charles. It's hard to say that name. He's still Prince Charles in many people's minds. They say he finally got a job at age 74 or whatever he is. Meanwhile, what he called for was a military-style mobilization to impose the global dictatorship for the purposes of deindustrializing and also depopulating the planet. And this is not just deindustrializing poorer countries, but Europe and the United States as well. And this is as his job as a spokesman for the City of London and their whiz kids who have built up a $2 quadrillion trading operation in derivatives and other financial assets, paper assets. At the same time, they're building up this bubble. They're shutting down the only way you can ever cover these kinds of costs, which is physical economic production. And they're moving for a decoupling of Western economies with Russia, China, and India, even as they're moving to crush the political and physical economy in Europe and the United States. Finally, this is part of the British operation, is to keep Diane Sare out of the one New York Senate debate that's taking place October 30th. I'll call your attention to a dialogue that Diane had with American military activist Scott Ritter, which just took place yesterday, and it's going to be linked at the bottom of the description page for you to listen to. But Ritter praised Diane for being one who's warning of the danger of nuclear war. And he insisted she should be included in the debate. And here's what he said, quote, "I endorse your message. I endorse the fact that you alone seem to understand what's important to the world, and that is having a future that will be denied to everybody if we have a nuclear conflict," unquote. He made it clear he's not endorsing Diane's campaign, although he did say we need someone like Diane in the U.S. Senate. So you can see that interview by clicking on the link at the bottom of the page. What's the attitude of the U.S. military in the midst of this crisis? Well, we saw another strange comment from Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder, who essentially asked, can we allow Russia to behave as it has during this special military operation? He said it's unacceptable. The United States cannot allow that kind of behavior, which he described as invading another country. What about the U.S. NATO bombing operations against Serbia in 1999? Was that unacceptable? How about the U.S. NATO invasions of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Libya, and the other wars, including the Syrian civil war that they fomented? Were those unacceptable? Again, we see the hypocrisy, which is why there's a move away from knuckling under to this unipolar order. Another example of that move away is what's happening with Saudi Arabia. On the one hand, they rejected Biden's demand that they increase energy production to cover for the loss of energy that was shut off with the Nord Stream pipeline bombing and the sanctions. But they also announced that they're interested in joining the BRICS Plus, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance. So this was from Mohammed bin Salman told the South African president during a state visit that they're very interested in joining. This is part of a trend that's going on with the global South, moving out from under the hammer that's applied by NATO and the United States to force countries to accept the unipolar order. Now, meanwhile, look at the situation in Europe. And I'll have more on this tomorrow, but just a few headlines. The United Kingdom is absolutely paralyzed by a crisis, and everyone is totally focused on the soap opera around Liz Truss, who was ruthlessly mocked yesterday during the Prime Minister's questions. The problem that they have in the United Kingdom is there's no clear replacement for her, and to kick her out after less than 2 months on the job just shows how ungovernable that situation has become. In France, there are gas lines. There are very large demonstrations on the 18th. More demonstrations coming. Tremendous anger against the government. In Germany, there are demonstrations which are growing. The government was forced to reverse their demand that the remaining 3 nuclear plants be taken offline. The compromise made by Schultz was to keep them online until April of next year. But this is splitting the coalition. The Greens don't want it. The Greens only wanted 2. The Free Democrats, the third party in the coalition, wanted it to be an indefinite continuation of the plants. So there are cracks in the coalition as Germany is looking at a very brutal winter ahead. Now, here's a question. Why has there been no reporting on the investigation underway into what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines? Well, I think you know the answer to that. Had they found evidence that Russia did it, we would have heard that already. So we probably will have more on that in tomorrow's report. Meanwhile, the EU announced their energy policy. It's essentially to give priority to hedge funds and speculators, derivative traders, ahead of the interests of the people who are going to be left to freeze to death. They're bailing out speculators. They say we'll consider regulation of futures markets in the future. And they've also lowered the margin requirements, and they're going to allow use of diverse financial paper other than cash as collateral, which means it will be easier to speculate and build up large debt. Meanwhile, the European Union inflation rate in September jumped from 10.1% in August to an official level of 10.9% in September. And it's reported in Greece that 3 out of every 10 people are facing the risk of dire poverty. And in this context, the EU just voted to give another $2 billion to Ukraine, maybe 2 billion euros. What a mess, huh? But luckily, we have solutions, and I'll discuss those tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday. It's your day for asking questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. And in the meantime, go to the dialogue between Scott Ritter and Diane Sare posted at the bottom of the description page. You'll hear solutions presented there by Diane, and you'll see an extremely important statement from Scott Ritter announcing his backing for Diane to be able to present these issues. So thanks for today. See you tomorrow.